Thank you for coming to our staff presentation series. This is something we're trying to do once a month where Tyler and I talk about areas of our expertise and share it at different points with people that maybe haven't heard us talk about it in the past. So what I'm presenting today is actually probably the first presentation I ever did out in public since being at the museum. Actually, the first time I did it was for the Buffalo History Museum. So the Holland Land Company and the development of Western New York. So there is a lot more to the history of how we got from wilderness in the 1780s to where we are today. The Holland Land Company being a major part of that, but there's even more to it than just what happened in our building. So I'm going to go through sort of the timeline with you, show you a few different maps, talk about some individuals that were prominent in that development. And if you're interested in the future, I do a follow-up to this called Joseph Ellicott's Ghost that kind of takes it to present day and how the land company's influence still impacts the area. So we will dive right in, and we're going to go all the way back to 1786. Now this map is from 1804, but we're going to go back a little bit farther. We're going to go back to the Treaty of Hartford. Now the area we know is Western New York, so basically from this preemption line west was disputed territory following the end of the Revolutionary War. Both New York and Massachusetts, their colonial rights, laid claim to that area. And we're talking about 6 million acres worth of land. So a pretty hefty sum. And both New York and Massachusetts had issues they were trying to solve. And this is probably one of the best treaties ever signed because both sides got exactly what they wanted. And that doesn't usually happen. So New York's issue was they were running out of land, especially land that they had proposed to their war veterans as payment for service. And Massachusetts had no money, so they worked out a deal that all of this land, Massachusetts was allowed to sell it and make the funds, but once it was sold, it would come under the jurisdiction of New York and then become part of New York. So Massachusetts would make the money but not have to worry about administering anything with it, and then New York got the land that they so desperately needed. So that's 1786. So in 1788, we have our first purchase within that area, which was called the Phelps-Gorham Purchase. Oliver Phelps and Nathaniel Gorham were two businessmen from Massachusetts who pooled their money together to buy that entire area, so all 6 million acres. And it was finally approved by the Massachusetts legislature on April 1st, 1788. And it was sold for a price of $1 million. And it was to be paid off in 3 equal sums. Phelps and Gorham paid off the first one, but in 1789, when the second payment comes due, they default. So what becomes known as the Phelps-Gorham Purchase is just from Seneca Lake to basically the Genesee River and Rochester area today. So the eastern third, which is about 2.25 million acres, we now know as the Phelps-Gorham Purchase, even though the original purchase stretched all the way. They set up their base camp in Canandaigua, so that's where their land office was. And they even worked out a deal with the Seneca of the Finger Lakes region to extinguish their rights. They gave them $5,000. And some reservation land, but not nearly what happens a little while later with the Big Tree Treaty. So once they default, we'll go back. All of this land goes back to Massachusetts, and they have to find a new buyer. And there's our defaultees there. Nathaniel Gorham actually signed the Constitution. Just a little fun fact about him. So if you can take that home and share that information. So our next person is Robert Morris. Robert Morris signed the Declaration of Independence. He also signed the Constitution. was tabbed to be the first Secretary of the Treasury, but declined, and that's how we got Alexander Hamilton as our Secretary of Treasury. He was one of the wealthiest men in the United States, probably the wealthiest, in the late 1780s. He basically funded the Revolutionary Army on his own. He had an extensive trade network based out of Philadelphia, and in the 1780s he got really into land speculation. And it made him a lot of money and then ended up losing him a lot of money. But one of his areas he purchased was Western New York. So from this line here all the way over he purchased. And eventually he starts parceling it out so he can make the money. Now Morris never set foot on this property. He never saw it. The only people of his family that saw it was his son Thomas, who he sent to kind of manage it and deal with any sales, but Robert Morris never saw it. And that's kind of a theme, is the people who have the money that buy this land don't ever come or see it. So Morris is basically looking for somebody to sell it to. He does not want to hold on to it. He wants to flip it. So a lot of the area in eastern Allegheny County down here, he ends up selling to what becomes known as the Poultney Estate for about $330,000 at about, so it was about 11 or 12 cents an acre, so if we do the math. Quite a big spot, but it was parts of Ontario County, which was all of this at the time. Yeah, so here's the Poultney purchase. You can see it here. But it stretched over here somewhat. But it was parts of Ontario, Steuben, Yates, Allegheny, Livingston, Monroe, Schuyler, and Wayne counties. So all those counties start to break out eventually, but it was all one area to start. And basically, Morris uses that money he gets from that to keep buying and keep buying more. So when he sells some off, he can buy some more, and eventually he owns all of this. But his goal is to find somebody else to buy as much of it as possible. And Philadelphia, where he lived and was his base of operations, was a bustling port city and the biggest city in the new colonies. And he finds a partner in 1791, and that partner is Theophilus Casanova, who was working for a group of Dutch investors called the Holland Land Company. And Casanova's job was to find large areas of open land that they could purchase and then develop and sell and make a lot of money. So he runs into Morris and they start negotiating, and in 1792 they are coming to an agreement where the land company will take over this section here, 3.25 million acres, and Morris's plan is to hold on to 500,000 called the Morris Reserve. This strip is about 12 miles wide and stretches the entire length of the state. So they have this sort of agreement that the land company will take over, but there's a lot of steps that have to happen before that happens. And Morris is really pushing for this because he's got a lot of debts that are being called in that he has to pay for. And eventually they come due, and between 1798 and 1800 he is actually imprisoned in a debtor's prison. So he goes from the richest man in the country to debtor's prison in a few years. And the United States actually changes their initial tax code to get Robert Morris out of prison as a thank you for all he did during the war. And he ends up dying soon after in 1806. So now that we're moving on to the land company, we have to jump ahead to 1797 because the negotiations start in 1792, but we have to go forward 5 years before we start to really move forward. Now, the Treaty of Big Tree was the biggest obstacle. Morris's plan and what he wanted and what needed to happen was the Seneca rights to what was called the Morris Purchase had to be extinguished before he could sell it. Otherwise, the land company was not going to buy it, and you could have had a lot of chaos going on. So they decide to meet it's called near Little Beardstown, who was one of the major Seneca chiefs along the Genesee River, at a giant oak tree, this is a rendering of. It was about 70 feet tall, and at its widest point was about 28 feet around. Right on the banks of the Genesee River, about where Geneseo is today. Unfortunately, around the 1870s, it fell into the river and is no more, but if you go to the Livingston County Historical Society in Geneseo, you can see a piece of it, a large piece of it. And we have a piece of it here in our museum, a small piece, but a piece. They picked that spot because that's really the boundary of American civilization. So there's a lot of different parties that are involved with this. From the Seneca perspective, you have 300 chiefs and important people coming from around the area to set up camp, including Red Jacket is one of those. Mary Jemison is there, though she is sort of a translator but becomes more involved. Corn Planter, Handsome Lake, all the major chiefs of the area are there. From Robert Morris's camp, you have his son Thomas Morris representing him. You have the Wadsworth family as the representatives of the United States government. Now, this treaty is not signed by the government, but they are there to make sure it goes smoothly and basically offer the good graces of the government saying, yes, we approve this, go ahead. But the United States government is not a signer on this. This is really between the Seneca, the Holland Land Company, and Robert Morris. And for the land company, you have Casanova, Halabusti eventually becomes involved, and then Joseph Ellicott is there as well, as he is going to do the surveying. So they start negotiations in August of 1797, and things are moving along rather slowly. There's a lot of negotiations. Red Jacket is one that is basically opposing the treaty from the start because the initial terms were not friendly at all to the Native Americans. They still don't remain friendly, but they get slightly better. And he's continuing to fight it because there's a lot of chiefs and leaders that wanted to sign it right from the get-go. And continuing to hold out. And reservations start to be carved out as they are reserved. That's why we call them reservations for the Native American populations. Mary Jemison, who wasn't supposed to get anything out of this deal, ends up getting one of the larger reservations for herself by her own negotiations, which is called Gardeau, which is basically much of Letchworth State Park today. But by early September, things are moving too slow, so they start to bring in the whiskey. And things speed up significantly after that. And eventually on September 16, 1797, the treaty is formally signed.
Whiskey is the lubricant.
More than that.
Yes, and it definitely was what got things moving along. Yes, so the eventual terms are that the Seneca of the area are reserved 10 reservations equaling about 200,000 acres. They are to receive $100,000 in U.S. bonds that are to be paid over time, and a large amount of livestock to go with that. So those 10 reservations are as follows. We have the Canalagus, which is Avon today, Big Tree, which is Geneseo, Little Beardstown, which is Kylerville, Squawky Hill, which is Leicester, Gardeau, which I mentioned, which is the Mount Morris area, Canandaigua, which is Houghton today, then the Cattaraugus, the Allegheny, the Buffalo Creek, and the Tonawanda. So there were 6 along the river. Those are the first 6 I listed, and the last 4 are farther west. Of course, I don't have that map up, but that's okay. But within 40 years, those 10 reservations are down to basically 4. So the Cattaraugus is Irving, Silver Creek area today. It's still there. The Allegheny is Salamanca. And Buffalo Creek, which was basically South Buffalo, Lackawanna, West Seneca, all that area, that's dismantled in the 1840s, sold off, and that's where those communities start to come up from. But if you ever go to South Buffalo, and particularly Indian Church Road, you are in the heart of the reservation. That's why there's a casino in Buffalo, because that's where it was part of the original reservation there. So that's why it's called the Buffalo Creek Casino. It goes back there. Red Jacket, Mary Jemison all end up moving to that area and die there, are buried there. Red Jacket eventually gets moved to Forest Lawn, but that's where he passes away. And the Tonawanda, which is right in our own backyard here, is still around. And then you have the Tuscarora, which was not part of the treaty. They come in a little bit later and get brought into the system, but they were not part of the treaty, big treaty originally. So, but pretty much all of them along the Genesee River are gone by the mid to late 19th century. So the system doesn't last very long. And all of the remaining reservations are severely reduced in size over time. So, now that the treaty is signed, the land company has now taken over 3.25 million acres worth of land, so what are they going to do? Well, Casanova, his job is sort of done, at least in the eyes of the land company. So, by about 1800, he has worn out his welcome. He's done a few bad deals and been caught not keeping records and all of that fun stuff that you expect your general agent to do. So he is let go, relieved of his duties, and Paulo Busti is brought in to take over. And he puts things in motion. It's Casanova, though. His one good thing is he hires Joseph Ellicott to do the survey. And by 1800, it is completed. But before we get too much into that, just talk about a few of the individuals who had the money that were part of the Holland Land Company over in the Netherlands, and where we actually get some names you may recognize in time. The most prominent is Willem Willink, because he lived the longest out of the original buyers, so that's why his name is on everything. So he was a merchant from Amsterdam and a main investor. And he actually invested in Louisiana Purchase eventually as well. So once the purchase went through, he bought his own section of land, which was about 100,000 acres. And there's a strip right down the middle that he owned, and then he owned a bunch over in what's Allegheny County today. So he had about 300,000 acres to his own that he would sell and make his money off of, separate of the land company. So he was heavily invested, probably the most invested, and so much so that his name was actually given to a town within what was the first 4 towns of Genesee County, because the whole thing was Genesee County. You had Batavia, Willink, then Cattaraugus, and Chautauqua. So Willink was a huge town, but eventually the name Willink gets shrunk down into this portion of Erie County here. About 8 towns made it up. You had Concord, Eden, Aurora, Boston, East Aurora today. Were all called Willink until about 1820s when Erie County splits off, and then all these towns start to get their own names again. So you also have Willink County and Willicks Creek, which are in the area that's named after the family. And in the original layout of Buffalo, Ellicott names a lot of the original streets after his employers. And Willink Ave was actually North Main Street today, was the name of it. Our next one is Nicholas van Staphorst. Had to really work on my Dutch pronunciations here. He was a banker and a politician over in the Netherlands. And he was big in the loaning of money during the Revolutionary War, which the Dutch bankers did heavily for the Constitutional Congress. And he was one of those. And South Main Street was named for him. So you had Willink Ave and you had Staphorst. Ave. And we've got the Van Egan brothers, Peter and Christian. So they were big traders and traded all over Europe and farther afield, and eventually set up camp down in Charleston for a little while too. And Christian Van Egan was actually the first director, so he was sort of the one kind of calling the shots for a while. And so they were another prominent person. Then you had Henrik Vollenhoven, who was actually born in South Africa, in the Dutch colony there, and joined the company after the initial purchase, and Erie Street was named Vollenhoven Street for a while. And then one of my favorites, Rutger von Schimmelpenninck. His last name is about 30 letters, so I'm glad that we don't see his name on a sign anymore. But he was another one who got heavily involved, but he was actually more famous for being a politician in Holland at the time. And it's important to remember that during this time, the Netherlands is not an independent nation. It's actually under French control under Napoleon. So Schimmelpenninck is actually a representative of the French crown, though begrudgingly, but he is a member of that government that's set up. And Niagara Street was actually called Schimmelpenninck Ave for a while. So it'd be about this long, the street sign, to get everything on there. And then you had William Willing's son, William Willing Jr., kind of takes over for his father and also is a signer on a lot of contracts. Peter Stadinsky is the other one I'll mention, because he was also heavily involved in the trading between Amsterdam and the United States. So these gentlemen made their money in trading and banking, started to pull it together, and that's how we get the Holland Land Company. So this is the Holland Land purchase as we see it today with the modern counties, but it was all Genesee County to start. That's why we sometimes call ourselves the mother of counties, because we go from 1 county to 8. Allegheny County is the first one in 1806, then Cattaraugus, Chautauqua, and Niagara all in 1808. But Niagara County initially had all of Erie County as well. Then Erie County breaks off in 1821, Orleans County in 1824, and the last one to come off of Genesee County, which happens at the very tail end of the Holland Land Company's history here, is Wyoming County in 1841. So in 40 years, we go from 1 county to 8 counties. And Ellicott was a big pusher of that, because the more counties we had in our area, the more representation we had in Albany, which meant we could influence more things, get more money heading out our way. So the man, the myth, the legend, Joseph Ellicott, he is probably the one most responsible for the development of Western New York, at least in its earliest phases. So Ellicott was actually born, he was born in 1760 in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, so right outside Philadelphia. But his father eventually moved the family to Maryland and founded a place called Ellicott Mills, Maryland, which still exists today and contributes right back to his family. His father, also named Joseph, was a miller, but also a clockmaker. So if you go to the Smithsonian and go to the Museum of American History, you can see one of his very ornate and complicated grandfather clocks there. So it's not this Joseph Ellicott, it's the older Joseph Ellicott, but there's an Ellicott thing in the Smithsonian. So I like to call the Ellicotts the first family of American surveying, because they are involved in every single major surveying project in the first 2 decades of the United States history. They are basically the ones writing the boundaries that we know as the United States. So Joseph's older brother, Andrew, he is actually tasked first with finding the boundary between Pennsylvania and New York. So he's the one that creates that boundary, and he's the one that lays out what we know as the Erie Triangle, where Erie, Pennsylvania is today, and maps out Presque Isle and that whole area. And Joseph helped him out with that. Andrew's next project was finishing up the layout of Washington, D.C., and laying out the District of Columbia. Both Joseph and his younger brother Benjamin helped him out with that. So the Ellicotts define the boundary of our capital. Then Andrew also, following the War of 1812, he is assigned the surveying following the Treaty of Ghent, which is the modern boundary between the United States and Canada, going all the way across. And Joseph himself is the one who creates the boundary between Spanish Florida and Georgia. So literally, the Ellicotts did our northern boundary and our southern boundary at the time. So the name Ellicott is who you think of when you think of American surveying. So when the land company is looking for a surveyor, who else do they call but Joseph Ellicott? Now Ellicott, previous to this, had done some surveying for them for their purchases in western Pennsylvania, but those were a little bit more disconnected and a lot tougher territory. So it's not as well known as here we are in western New York, but he was well known to them. So after the Treaty of Big Tree, Ellicott gets to work trying to come up with how he's going to do his great survey. Now his plan is to complete this in 2 years, to survey 3.25 million acres in 2 years. It takes him 3, but he still gets it done. But he needs to get a team together, he needs to get all his provisions, so he spends an entire winter in Philadelphia doing that, eventually collects 150 men, surveyors, frontiersmen, agents, all of that to get all of this done, including his brother Benjamin. And this is where Ellicott starts to really etch his name in history, as he needs a standardized unit to give all of his workers as something to base off of. Now, surveyors at the time used iron chains, and the chains were pretty standardized, but other than that, there really wasn't much. Especially the unit that we use, the foot, was not standardized yet. It was supposed to be based off the king's foot, but we're not even a part of the king's domain anymore. So Ellicott sets out to find out what his foot's going to be. So he finds all of the foot-long rulers of the day that he can and takes the average, and it comes out to 12 inches. So he makes a bunch of 12-inch brass rulers for his workers to take on as they're surveying to help them get a standardized unit. And today, we still use 12 inches in a foot. So Ellicott is actually the home of the 12-inch ruler. During the survey, he also measures the height of Niagara Falls. He's the first person to do that. He lays out the early village of Buffalo and even founds Batavia. Not bad for 3 years. And they had an issue when they're setting out surveying. How are they going to measure things? How are they going to perceive things? Because what was used was a transit. But at the time, there was only one portable transit in the entire United States, and his brother Andrew was using it. So his younger brother Benjamin actually invents one that they can take with them. And they're able to use a transit that there isn't another one in the entire country, basically.
What exactly is a transit?
So it's sort of a combination of other instruments if you think about it. It's really one, but when you look at it, you'll think it's a bunch of different things together. So it's like a periscope, a compass, and a level all together. So you're looking through a lens to measure against the horizon, and you're using that against points that you're trying to triangulate, basically. And there's a compass on it so you know which direction you're going, and it's usually on a tripod so that you can keep it level to keep your measurements. So
I think I've seen one.
we have a few, we have them on display, not on the tripods, but you can see how they kind of function. So in 3 years they complete the survey. Now they are ready to sell. So Ellicott needs to set up a base of operations. He starts his first selling in Buffalo because that's where he ends up after the survey. And then he spends a winter in Clarence at the Ace of Ransom Tavern because that is pretty much the only place that exists. And so a few plots are sold from there. And then eventually he works his way farther east here to Batavia, sets up shop here, founds Batavia. Now, Batavia is not the original name he wanted to call it. He was going to call it after his boss, Paul Boosty, so he almost called it Boostyville. Maybe we're have been Bustyville, I don't know. They agreed, no, we don't like that, let's pick something else. So Boosty says, why don't you name it after yourself since you're the one who founded it? So they almost went with Ellicott's Town, and eventually they settled on Batavia because that is actually the area of Holland where their bosses were from. And Batavia means good land, actually. So, perfect name. Though there is an issue because it wasn't the first Batavia, New York. Down along the Hudson, there was a Batavia, New York that still existed. So for the first decade or two, you couldn't mail something to this Batavia, New York, you had to mail it to Genesee County Courthouse. Eventually the other Batavia disbands, basically, is not incorporated anymore. So now we are the only Batavia, New York, but we are one of 8 Batavias in the United States. So just kept spreading west. But both Boosty and Ellicott get towns named after them. You have Bustine, New York, down in Chautauqua County, and Ellicottville, named after Joseph Ellicott. So never fear, they got their towns, even if it wasn't this one. So Ellicott's original spot was right about where we are. He built a small log cabin that was sort of the first office, but immediately he starts working on his home, which would have been kitty corner from us across the street here. A beautiful mansion that it becomes, the largest house in Batavia with 2 massive wings and a large center structure. And he ends up moving the office into the west wing of that building. Now, with the War of 1812 and the burning of Buffalo, Western New York is very scared of invasion from Canada, and they decide they need a more permanent structure for the land company here to hold all the valuable things and papers. So in 1815, they start construction on the stone, there's the Ellicott Mansion there, right on Main Street. And there's the early village of Buffalo. I mentioned all of those Dutch names. There they are. They decided to go with more Native American names after that, but originally it was all Dutch names. And for a few years, Buffalo was even called New Amsterdam in honor of their Dutch overlords.
Yeah, I saw that on that first map you showed.
Yes.
I thought that was New York City at one time.
It was. But this was at the very beginning. The village wasn't really even a village yet. It was just kind of a spot on a map. There's a few dozen people, but it eventually grows rather quickly. But here's early Batavia. So this is the original layout of streets that Ellicott came up with. And at that time, basically all the road names told you where you were going to go. So Buffalo Street is Route 5 today, but going west because it goes to Buffalo. Genesee Street is Route 5 going east because you're going to the Genesee River. And let's see, we got Tonawanda Street, which is South Main today because, well, it's along the Tonawanda Creek. And Buffalo Road is Route 33 going south or going west on Pearl Street because, again, you're going to Buffalo Road. So we have Buffalo Street and we have Buffalo Road. Make sure you know which one you're going on. Stevens Street, which is Walnut today and going down 98. Named Stevens Street because James Stevens was one of Ellicott's most trusted people within the land company, and he owned all of this land down here. Jackson is an original. South Street is South Jackson today. Big Tree because it goes to the Big Tree Reservation. That's 63. That'll take you right to Geneseo. And Elba Street is Oak Street today because, well, guess where it went? Elba.
I grew up there.
And then Cemetery Street because that's where eventually the cemetery is set up. But Ellicott picks our spot and founds Batavia here for a few different reasons. First off, it's at a confluence of several major Native American trails, so people are already coming this way. In fact, this was a prominent meeting spot for Native American groups. Not a village, but a spot. And where we are was called the place of hearing, so it's where they would all come to talk things out. And we are on the bend in the Tonawanda, and that's where they would usually meet, right about here. And we are very close to the eastern edge of the purchase. So if you're trying to sell land and everybody's coming from the east, because everybody buying is basically coming from New England or eastern New York, Setting up in Buffalo doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense because they can come all the way across before they ever get to you, and what's to stop them from just running amok? So you pick Batavia, and that's where the center of operations are. Eventually, as the counties start to break up from the original Genesee County, they get their own land office. So for instance, there was one in Angelica, there was one in Ellicottville, Mayville, Buffalo, Lockport, and Orleans and Wyoming never get one because they're close enough to Batavia that wasn't necessarily necessary, and eventually, so people could come to Batavia for everything, or they could go to their individual county ones to take care of things too. And here is a very early rendering of the land office. So this is Main Street right here, and we had a nice little fence out front and covered in some ivy, but that's the original structure. An interesting thing to point out is if you look at the front of the building today, there are plaques in this spot up here. Those were originally windows. So there used to be a second set of windows above here. And there were two chimneys. You can still see one chimney, the fireplaces in the original structure, but they both had full-fledged chimneys. So, and the creek would have been literally almost right out the back door. So it was built very close to the creek line. And here's the interior. So this is the bottom floor, and the top floor would have mirrored it almost identically because there were offices upstairs and downstairs. So getting back to Ellicott for a brief moment, he works with the company until 1821. He's a major proponent of getting the Erie Canal running this way. The Holland Land Company actually had their own plan for the Erie Canal that would run dead center through the purchase, dumping out into Lake Erie, but that was quickly realized that that was almost impossible and would have cost way too much money than what the state was willing to do. So what the land company ends up doing is donating 100,000 acres to go towards the purchase. Now, it wasn't land that the canal goes through. It was actually some rather hard land to cultivate down in the southern tier, but the sales from that went towards New York State to help pay for the canal construction. But eventually, Ellicott starts to make enemies in Albany, doesn't back DeWitt Clinton, the governor of New York, and doesn't have a lot of friends left, so Boosty and the land company decide to relieve him of his job as resident agent here in Batavia. I call Ellicott a workaholic. He never married, never had children. This place was his life, his work. So after he is deprived of this, he tries to do some other ventures, tries to make some other purchases that don't go well, and eventually his mental health deteriorates. So much so to the point that his family sends him to an insane asylum in New York City to hopefully get well. And that is where he meets his end. He actually commits suicide in that asylum by hanging himself in a closet. He's initially buried in a cemetery in New York City, but his sister Rachel eventually brings his body back to Batavia, and he is buried in the family plot here with the Ellicott Monument, and the whole group is buried there in our historic Batavia Cemetery. So the land company operates out of our building here until around 1840 or so. There's not necessarily a true cutoff, but around 1836, 1837, there's some serious issues going on that force their hand. In the early 1830s, New York State changes the tax code and is very heavily going to tax property owned by foreign entities, which the Holland Land Company is. So they are desperate to sell off as much as they can so they are not getting taxed for it. So they step up their collection policies, and doesn't necessarily make people pretty happy. So there's actually a movement going around West New York basically trying to force the land company to change its ways or force them out. This comes to a head in 1836, when a group in Chautauqua County of a few hundred men storms the Mayville office and burns it to the ground. All that's left is the stone vault, which is still there today, right by the county building in Mayville. William Peacock, who was the agent down there, he escapes with his life, but everything is destroyed in the building, and the farmers are so excited because they just erased all of their debt. Little did they know that everything had already been duplicated and sent here. So nothing was gone, but it sent a statement, and many other groups start to have similar ideas against the land company, and actually in early 1837, a group of about 500 marches on the building here and is making similar threats. Now, word got back here to David Ellicott Evans, who was Joseph's nephew, the agent here at the time, and he started to fortify this place. Now, this building, the land office, was built out of limestone, and the walls are about 20 to 24 inches thick. Now, they built it that way because there were no banks west of the Genesee River when it was built, so it had to be built like a bank to be very secure, and their biggest concern was fire. So if you build it out of stone, then at least the structure will survive. Things inside might burn, but it'll survive. So he fortifies this place. He gets 50 muskets and several men to join him, and they are going to protect this building. Now, when the group gets to Main Street, right in front of the building, the sheriff and the local militia show up, and they say, well, don't do it. Think about this. And after a day, cooler heads prevail, and everybody disperses. So I like to call it the siege of the land office, though there was never a shot fired, and nothing ever really happens, but it was very tense at the time. But at this point, the land company says, enough's enough, we're getting out. So they start to sell off assets to other landowners, other land companies. Leroy is a big one, Hernan Leroy, and they start to sell off pieces. Trumbull Carey is another one, names that we kind of know from our local history. They buy up large sections. And now it's their responsibility to sell and manage those properties. So land company is still here until the 1840s. I have original ledgers that show transactions going into the 1840s, about 1844. I don't know if they were just kind of closing things out or what if they were truly selling anything more. But by that point, everything has basically been sent back to Amsterdam. And the land office is now under new management. But before all of that happens, there's a lasting mark that the land company leaves, and that is the roads across western New York. Most of our major roads today can be taken all the way back to the early 1800s with the land company. So we have Route 5 going all the way across. We have Route 63 going north and south. We have Route 98 going north and south. We have Route 19. We even have the Thruway, the Erie Road, which the Thruway follows along Lake Erie and Route 28. So all of those major roads that we still drive around everywhere today, we have the land company to thank for at least starting them off. Now, a lot of those did follow Native American trails, but it's the land company that makes them true roads. Because they knew that if they did not have transportation and infrastructure, nobody would be able to come, and the land would be pretty much useless. So by the late 1840s, the land company is no more. They have gone back. Our office here until about 1850s or so still is the land office. It's just under different partners. Then it becomes Mrs. Bryan's seminary, school for young ladies. They stayed in Ellicott's mansion and went to school here. And then it becomes a church. The Free Methodist congregation meets here. And they're the ones that take out the wall in the big room in the front. So that's why that one's larger than the other. And then in 1894, the Holland Purchase Historical Society is founded, and creates this into a museum. So we are actually celebrating our 130th year as a museum. So that is the history. That is how we go from wilderness at the Treaty of Hartford all the way up to, we'll say, 1850 essentially, and then progress continues on from there. But the land company and those involved are really the ones that make Western New York what we know it today. Are there any questions?
But you're building in different spots for me that I didn't have. So that's good. Thank you.
You're welcome. We're always here for other questions, so feel free to reach out to us. We can tell you all about this. This is what I talk about on a daily basis, so I can always share more. So, well, thank you, everyone.